I'm going to be honest with you guys. Dream of the Red Chamber is kind of a strange book. The book starts off with a philosophic passage, and then we're transported way back in time to a tale from Chinese mythology. So we watch as the goddess Nuwa uses thousands of massive stones to patch up the sky, but has one stone left over. That stone then becomes sentient, or has the ability to move and think. It's then taken to Earth by a Buddhist monk and a Taoist priest, and then it returns to heaven with an entire story written on its face, or in stone. A different Taoist priest then discovers the stone and then starts to interact with it. And by the time you get that far, you start wondering, if you're actually reading the right book. I mean, I certainly did when I first read Dream of the Red Chamber. That part was totally strange, and after that, it only got stranger. Now, the stone can talk, apparently, and it goes off on a rant about contemporary Chinese literature to that second Taoist priest. I'm serious about this, by the way. This is literally a full-scale rant. It's like something that you would expect to see if they had internet message boards back in 18th century China. The stone criticizes the so-called unofficial history fictional creations that were popular at that time. The stone also criticizes contemporary romantic writing as obscene and filthy. It then attacks the so-called Caizijiaren books. These are books about talented men and beautiful women as being too predictable and stereotypical. And in the end, according to the stone, those works are overly moralistic, overly literary, use too many classical phrases, have no emotional backing, and are self-contradictory. Now, I should remind all of you that this is just the first few lines of the book. I mean, before we've met a single main character, before we know anything about the book itself, we've already seen this totally bizarre cosmic play, and we've also heard the author's rant about literature. So what's going on here? Well, the truth is that Dream of the Red Chamber is a subversive book at heart. Now, I should slow down a little bit first. So by subversive, what I mean is that the book deliberately works contrary to what the reader expects. And it's not just modern Western readers like me in the internet age that feel surprised and get really alienated by this book right at the beginning. Chinese readers hundreds of years ago would have felt the same way. Okay, let me show you just how strange its opening really is by comparing it to a few other famous Chinese books. So the famous Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or Sanguoyanyi, starts with an epic beginning, but then it goes right into the story of Shuenda as a child. Shuenda, of course, later becomes the famous hero Liu Bei. Water Margin, or Shuihu Zhuan, starts off with a series of natural disasters as the leaders of the country struggle to figure out what to do. It starts off with the action. Journey to the West, or Shioji, starts right off with the monkeys. So Sun Wukong, who many of you know as Son Goku from the Dragon Ball series, is introduced right off the bat. Even Plum in the Golden Vase, or Jinping Mei, which is probably the most notorious and vulgar novel in Chinese literary history, starts off with a description of the dissolute and notorious male protagonist. It gets right to the action. Well, there's this tendency that we have when we read foreign literature, especially older foreign literature, to simply dismiss things that are strange as what people from that time or from that place must have considered to be normal. And sometimes that works, but it doesn't work with Dream of the Red Chamber. This is not normal. But then the question is, what in the world is Cao Xueqin doing? Well, let me give you a few more examples of odd things just from the early chapters of the book. So late in the first chapter, Zhen Shirin's beloved daughter Ying Lian is kidnapped. Zhen Shirin then proceeds to lose everything he owns. He loses his house, his land, then his money, and eventually his health. He meets up with a Taoist priest, and this is the same priest that had the stone back in the mythical beginnings of the book. But instead of helping him and offering at least condolences, the priest taunts him with the so-called Haoliao song. This is a biting and sardonic rhyme about how the only right way to live through life is to abandon all worldly attachment. Well, that sounds like a religious statement, right? Or maybe it's some sort of moral message? Well, just wait. Well, Zhen Shirin sighs and he offers an extremely emotional poem in response. Now, this stuff is pretty hard to read. It's really emotional. Why boast of fresh roug and fragrant powder, he says, now that your hair has turned to frost? Where yesterday white bones were buried in yellow earth, tonight lovebirds nest beneath crimson silk drapes. Yeah, this is pretty deep stuff. I mean, it's all about how nothing in life is really worth doing, how you're just going to wind up deceased in the end and everything else will just move on. I mean, that's pretty depressing, and it's almost like a sardonic response to the priest. Well, in the end, Zhen Shirin replies with a fantastic line. It's all absurd, he says, and in the end you're just sewing someone else's bridal clothes. Now, this is a direct reference in Chinese to a Tang Dynasty poem by the famous female poet Qin Taoyu. Now, Qin Taoyu's poem is really interesting. It's a biting and a very direct criticism of the way that society treated women during the Tang Dynasty. I dare to boast about my nimble fingers, she writes at the end, but refuse to paint long eyebrows and shallow lines. I've spent year after year in meticulous, exhausting labor only to be sewing another woman's bridal gown. Now, that phrase at the end of this poem, only to be sewing another woman's bridal gown, that is exactly the language that Cao Xueqin uses at the end of its poem. I mean, it's exactly word for word the same. It's not just a reference, it's a direct quote. And that should make you think, why would a Confucian gentleman, even though he's down on his luck, why would a man make a direct reference to a famous poem written by a woman in China in the 18th century? Now, that's what I mean by subversion. Well, author Cao Xueqin of Dream of the Red Chamber is always playing these games with gender differences. In the first chapter of the book, he describes the women he knew when he was younger as superior to him, saying that his beard and mustache were no match for their skirts and hairpins. During the Stone's early rant about Chinese literature, it says that none of the classical phrases and stories of literature could come close to the women that it saw and spoke with during its lifetime. And later, in the beginning of the third chapter, the famous girl Lin Daiyu has to leave her father and her home after her mother dies. Now, the implication is that her father will not marry again, and that therefore she would have a better chance at a good life if she lived with her mother's relatives. And when Lin Daiyu arrives at that house, she winds up only meeting the women at first. They seem to be the only people running the show. The men are all busy with ridiculous and pointless activities. Every single step of the way, the women in the book end up taking charge. So what we're going to see as we go through this is that the two male leaders of the Jia household turn out to be completely useless. Jia She is supposed to be the guy in charge. He ends up spending all of his time fooling around with a bunch of this senseless Taoist mysticism. And Jia Zheng, who's supposed to be this refined Confucian gentleman, is basically an utter buffoon. But then Cao Xueqin defies our expectations again. So after his bitter lament, Cao Xueqin decides to go with the Taoist priest anyway, completely abandoning his wife and his missing daughter in the process. Cao Xueqin spends then an entire chapter, the whole second chapter of the book, having two other minor characters talk about the main characters of the book, who we haven't met yet. It's a real odd and gossipy conversation, and it's certainly not like anything I've ever read in any great works of literature. And then in the third chapter, it becomes clear right away that the most dominant person in the family is a female character. This is Wang Shifeng, even though proper etiquette would doom her to a more obscure position. Now, it turns out that Wang Shifeng is the only person in the family who understands money, and that includes the men. Her control over the purse gives her immense power over the entire family. Now, none of this is normal for Chinese literature. We already showed that. I mean, true Confucian scholars are supposed to be above money and business and that sort of thing. But the honest reality in this book is that the scholars and the religious figures end up being largely useless. Well, we already talked about how the only comfort the Taoist priest could give poor Cao Xueqin was a mocking nursery rhyme. Now, as the book continues, we will see that Buddhism and Taoism are often associated with fraud and deceit, not with religious enlightenment. Jia Zheng, who is supposed to be a Confucian gentleman, is a total fool. And even Jia Yucun, one of the first characters we meet in the story, is likely a fraud. There's a lot of evidence for this. Jia Baoyu, who is the main male character, dislikes most men and wants to spend all of his time with the girls. And honestly, given the sort of men that are around him, I don't think I can blame him. Anyway, in short, the entire book is about subversion. It's about playing with your expectations as a reader and then turning them completely upside down. Now, the other thing I've got to say here is that it really is amazing that this book was mostly written in like the 1750s and 1760s. I mean, a lot of this reminds me of the fiction of, say, Lu Xun in the 1920s. Cao Xueqin was an incredibly modern thinker, and the real interesting thing is that a lot of this is really lost and obscured in the English translations that are around today. So come on over to redchamber.blog, to my publication, check out my post, check out my translation, and look for more insights like this, and I will see you in the next video.